All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you here tonight, and we're so excited to have Andrew Rimby with us here tonight. We're having him back again with us. We had him a few weeks ago for our Janes Hill tour, and that was an amazing experience. I don't think I've ever seen a Zoom be outdoors like that event was. It was an incredible experience. We climbed to the top of Janes Hill, which is a place where we know that Whitman had visited. And if you're interested in that video, it is on our YouTube currently. So please check that out. If you're interested in walking up there, it's right in Huntington, near the birthplace actually. So you can plan your trip up there. And Andrew continues to bring us just really fascinating topics. I'm going to talk about another wonderful event he's going to have with us on Zoom next month in just a moment. But I always want to start every event by saying thank you so much to everyone who donates. It's so meaningful to us, the way that we've received all this support through the past few months, the way that we've collected so many people. It feels like we have like a Whitman-esque family starting here on Zoom. And so thank you so much for that support. It means multitudes to us. Even the smallest amount is just a lot to us. And I also want to say thank you for joining us. That also means so much to us. We are growing with each week, and that helps us also get support from grants and things. So absolutely just being here is a huge support. So thank you. We have a few things in the chat. All right. So I want to tell you a little bit about our upcoming events. And let's see, where are we? All right, so for next week, we're going to have poet and social worker Bree Onisha with us on Thursday. It'll be at 6:30 p.m., so 1 week from today. And Bree is a wonderful local poet. You might have seen her perform before. She's just incredible. And her work as a social worker also just brings up so many fascinating topics, and it's wonderful to hear her share. So definitely check out that event. And the following week we have Walking with Whitman, another program from them. And it's been 10 years of Walking with Whitman, and it's been so amazing having it on Zoom. We've grown there too. And George Wallace is our host for Walking with Whitman for the past 10 years. He's phenomenal. You probably saw him a few weeks ago when he joined us with his poetry reading. So definitely check that out on Friday, October 2nd. That will be, so Friday, not Thursday for that week, because traditionally it's always on a Friday, our Walking with Whitman program. Then the following week on Thursday, we have Bill Ratner with us, and he's a poet. He's a storyteller for The Moth, which you've probably heard of. And he does the voiceovers for movie trailers. And he was the voice actor for a G.I. Joe character named Flint back in the 80s. And he did the voice for a video game called Mass Effect for a character for that. So please join us for that. You will, I can almost promise you'll recognize his voice from the movie trailers. And he's a great storyteller. So that is going to be on the 8th of October. And then one more event I want to share is we'll have Andrew back again with us on Sunday, the 11th of October, and that will be at 1 p.m. And this time he's going to bring us through Huntington Village. The tour is called The Traveling Bachelor in Huntington Village, Whitman Walking Tour. And he's going to share the historic parts of Huntington Village with us. But if you are coming from a great distance, maybe you haven't had the opportunity to be to Long Island, you'll also see the beautiful village of Huntington, which is definitely a tourist destination for sure. All right. So without further ado, I do want to introduce Andrew. Go. Andrew Rimby is a PhD candidate in the English department at Stony Brook University. His dissertation, The Pool of Narcissus, Transatlantic Homoerotic Attachments, 1837 through 1901, argues that Walt Whitman, Oscar Wilde, and other 19th century writers used ancient Greek allusions to express male homoerotic desire before the term homosexuality is invented. He is a 2019 Giuliano Global Fellow, a 2019 to 2020 Public Humanities Fellow, and a 2019 Stony Brook Graduate Fellow in the Arts, Humanities, and Lettered Social Sciences. So thank you so much for being here, Andrew. We're so excited to have you back. You bring us all these fascinating topics. They're so inventive. And I have not seen anyone else be outside on Zoom, so I have to also give you a lot of credit for that. So thank you so much, and I'm going to hand the spotlight right over to you now.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Caitlin, and the Whitman birthplace at large. I love getting to present my work. So what I'm going to be presenting right now is actually the opening to my dissertation. So I've called it A Queer Meeting, Whitman and Wilde in Camden, New Jersey. First, though, I want to recognize I have a lot of Whitman and Wilde souvenirs here. So I thought maybe I would resurrect them for us tonight. And I want to start with a quote. So this is, all of you who've read Whitman, you're going to know this right away. But do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. So the speaker from Song of Myself states that, and this talk is going to be full of contradictions. And the first is going to be just centering on how queer desire really starts to circulate between Walt Whitman and Oscar Wilde. Two figures who we don't always think about together. So I want to begin right away just by explaining, and I want to show you, or I'll show you after. Let me just explain what I'm going to be detailing, and then some questions I'll pose. And I want all of you out there too, who are watching, keep these questions in your mind, and maybe you want to bring it up during the Q&A. So the year is 1882. Celebrated Victorian novelist Oscar Wilde has just arrived in New York City to begin the first of his many lectures in America on the philosophy of beauty. And then I'll show you right now the picture. Okay, so the picture of Wilde on the right was taken in New York City in 1882. Interestingly, it mirrors that of the infamous American poet Walt Whitman when he had his picture taken in 1854 in New York City. So the 1854 photo of Whitman was done by Samuel Hollier, and it's a daguerreotype. So it was one of the early inventions of photography. And then on the right, Oscar Wilde had his done by Napoleon Serrani, taken in Union Square. I'm just going to jump back so you can see me. So right after Whitman finished lecturing in Washington Square Park, he demanded to his press team that he needed to see Walt Whitman when he was going to arrive in Philadelphia. So he knew that Whitman was living in Camden, and he kept insisting that he would not leave the Philly area until he saw Walt Whitman and spoke with him and had an interview with him. So my questions are, why was Wilde so insistent and infatuated with meeting Whitman? At the time, Oscar Wilde in 1882 is 27, and that's actually how old I am. But so sometimes I feel like I'm doing a sort of mirroring of Wilde and Whitman. And Whitman, it was 62. So a very large age gap. And then a lot of literary scholars, they wrote that Wilde's major motive for meeting Whitman was to learn how to become a literary celebrity and how to self-fashion himself. However, I claim that it's not only this literary celebrity aspect that Wilde is interested in, but something more, something that Wilde is quoted as saying, which is he desired to have the kiss of Whitman on his lips. And I'll get more into that and when that actually is said by Oscar Wilde, because that's an even fascinating history behind that quote. So Wilde's desire to meet Whitman is concerned, in my opinion, about an American poet, Walt Whitman, who openly discusses male same-sex desire, mostly in Calamus, but you can find it in other poetry that I'll reference tonight. And Oscar Wilde found a model and a mirror. So that's why those photos, I'll go back to it real quick, I find so fascinating because, Wilde even fashions himself in the same gesture of Whitman's photo from 1854. Okay. Just see. I'm just going to move on to the next slide. There we go. Okay. So this is Wilde in New York City. You'll see he took another photo on the left-hand side. That's much more what you would call the dandy fashion. And if you know anything about Wilde, he really did start to get defined as a literary dandy, meaning a high-fashioned intellect. And then you can also see a picture of what Union Square looked like in 1897. I'm going to jump. So Wilde delivers the lecture in New York City. The building is called Chickering Hall, so it's no longer there, but that's what the building looked like. And it was called the English Renaissance of Art. Wilde talks about aestheticism. So he calls it, and it becomes known as the art for art's sake movement, and really comes from Keats's poetic line about beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. He's sent by Richard D. Oily Hart, who is the business manager for Gilbert and Sullivan, the operetta composers. Most of us, I know them for the HMS Pinafore, but this was for a lesser known work called Patience. Hart was very nervous that Americans would not understand what this operetta was about, because it centers on aesthetes. So he sent Oscar Wilde, who rose to the challenge to go around the United States talking about the aesthetic movement. But what I'll really argue is every time I've read all of the lectures he gave in the US, Oscar Wilde, nothing is really about the aesthetic movement. It's all about his own celebrity status. And he just was beginning to write. So he actually had not written The Picture of Dorian Gray yet. That comes out in 1890. So he uses this as an influencer project. He was a very early influencer. Okay, now let me just, I'm gonna jump to the next slide. Okay, so this terminal still exists. If you grew up in New York City, it's on the Jersey City side. It's called a Communipaw Terminal. This is where, well, was built in 1889, but Oscar Wilde did go to the original terminal that was in that spot to head to Philadelphia. So I'm just going to talk about how he arrives in Philadelphia, because it really becomes important to know just even what goes on the train ride. So to get to Philadelphia, he actually had to go on a ferry to Jersey City from Manhattan. There was no Penn Station yet, and this train took him all the way down to Philadelphia. Hence, eventually, why Penn Station is known as Penn Station. It connects New York City to Pennsylvania. Okay, so this is what I find really full of so much information about my topic. It's a Philadelphia Press article called A Talk with Wilde. And it's actually a interview Wilde does while he's on the train car with a journalist. So a journalist decides that he's going to hop on with Wilde and interview him during the whole train ride. So I'm just going to read a little quote because I think it really shows you who Oscar Wilde is as a person. He, Wilde, scans the flitting landscape closely, sometimes smiling like a child at a glistening stream or a stretch of yet green meadow, and again seeming to find the sorrow of old age in the frequent expanses of brown country and dripping black undergrowths made more dreary by the overcast sky. And I'm going to jump back real quick. One of my favorite parts of this is, you'll see it on the next slide, but Oscar Wilde, from what the interviewer says, so we should question maybe if the interviewer is embellishing some of this for journalistic sake, but Oscar Wilde apparently is so depressed when he's passing the Meadowlands area, that's the black undergrowth section. But then eventually we'll see a change, and he starts to light up when the interviewer questions him about Walt Whitman, because the interviewer asks him, well, who are some of your favorite American writers? And he says, well, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry James, who, if you know Henry James, kind of is that transatlantic British and American figure. And then he says Walt Whitman. So just see here. I try to like show you what the journey would look like now, but now you can see I think it's a quicker train ride. So, right, he's going all the way past Trenton now. Okay. Here's the Meadowlands, right? And they still look the same because they can't build anything there because of the geography. And Wilde is asked about why he was chosen. Why not some of the other Victorian poets? You know, why not Dante Gabriel Rossetti? Why not Robert Browning, right? Why is Wilde coming to make this voyage? And he's young, right? 27. That's a young author. So the reporter keeps questioning Wilde and prods Wilde and asks, is it because the Victorian poets are ashamed or embarrassed of American writers? And Wilde says, no. Quote, they did not regard it at all as an aesthetic mission to a barbarous clime. So our barbarian climate, right? This is Wilde's language. But our artists, the Victorian artists, wish very much to have their ideas planted and growing in America. And then again, I'm not going to read it again, but Wilde is just really repulsed by how the Meadowlands are really affecting his soul. But then what I do like, and it shows you a lot about Wilde's ideas about beauty, which he says, you know, with all of this marshland, why they might have great fields of callus growing there. Do you understand my love for lilies and roses and sunflowers? No. Oh, don't you know there is no flower so purely decorative as the sunflower? And if you know anything about Wilde, he's infatuated with the sunflower. There's actually cartoons of Wilde with sunflowers. Okay. So part 2 of the journey. Now, Wilde is going from Trenton to Broad Street Station in Philadelphia. The reporter asks, what poet do you most admire in American literature? Wilde, I think that Walt Whitman and Emerson have given the world more than anyone else. I do so hope to meet Mr. Whitman. Perhaps he is not widely read in England, but England never appreciates a poet until he is dead. I always laugh at Wilde's deadpan humor, I guess. And if you don't know, Wilde actually is Irish. He was born to a Dublin family, but then he goes to he goes to Trinity College, and then he makes his way to Oxford. And that's where he starts to associate with other Victorian aesthetic poets. Specifically, so he says here, I admire Whitman intensely. Dante Rossetti, Swinburne, William Morris and I often discuss him. There is something so Greek and sane about his poetry. It is so universal, so comprehensive. And he goes on to mention the importance of poets. And I'll just talk about the picture real quick so you know what this is. In the background is the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And this is present day, but Fairmount Park is located right here. And the Waterworks building was built in 1812. So Whitman would have seen the Waterworks, which is right on the Schuylkill River. Okay, so he says that poets are always ahead of science. All the great discoveries of science have been stated before in poetry. So far as science comes in contact with our school, aestheticism, the art of beauty, we love its practical side, but we think it absurd to seek to make the material include the spiritual, to make the body mean the soul, to say that one emotion is only a secretion of sugar and another nothing but a contraction of the spine. And then he becomes melancholy again. And this is actually not my language. This is the interviewer mentioning that Wilde is melancholy now. So it's this article in the Philadelphia Press is also a type of psychoanalytic analysis of how Oscar Wilde is interacting with the journalist. And then Wilde apparently lights up at Fairmount Park, and it brings back a happy smile, and he's greatly pleased with arriving at Broad Street Station. Okay, here's a picture of what Broad Street Station looked like. It's no longer existing in this form. Okay, and I'm going to jump back a little to discuss. So far, once Wilde has arrived in Philadelphia, he's slotted to appear at Fairmount Park in a place called Horticultural Hall, kind of like an outdoor amphitheater. And he again insists that he needs to see Walt Whitman. He is not going to leave the Philadelphia area until he does. So now I can jump back real quick. Okay. So he actually gives his talk before meeting Walt Whitman, and this is important. So there's Horticultural Hall. Sadly, again, this building doesn't exist, but it looks beautiful. It was an arena of sorts. I'm just going to read a little of this aesthete's lecture, just so you understand how the press received Oscar Wilde, especially when he was giving his philosophy of beauty talk, which was his mission, or supposed to be his mission touring around the US. So one journalist says, "There has been a remarkable agitation among the fair inmates of the Aldine Hotel because of the advent among them of Oscar Wilde, the aesthete poet who lectured last night in Horticultural Hall. Even the chambermaids have been excited, and by some strange psychological mystery, the elevator is crowded with ladies when the aesthete is going down, and the same thing happens when the poet is going up." So again, it makes me just laugh, because the journalists are not interested in what Whitman, sorry, I do that a lot. Sometimes I'll say Whitman instead of Wilde, the W's, what Wilde was saying at Horticultural Hall. Instead, they're interested at this Center City Hotel, the Aldine Hotel, and how all of these groups of ladies were gossiping just to, and fanning out over Oscar Wilde. And I'll just read one more section because this always makes me laugh. Feeling peculiarly the embarrassment of his position, Oscar Wilde, he has been taking his usual half-holiday, and with tender solicitude for the fair guests, does not invade the dining hall, but has his meals sent to his room. So, instead of actually meeting his fans, he makes sure that he runs to his hotel room and basically barricades himself in the room. Maybe he's overwhelmed, right? I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. But I think at the same time, too, Oscar Wilde is really creating a celebrity status for himself. So the more that he withholds from the public, the more they want to ask questions about him. And that really comes through in the journalism. What's really interesting in the next turn of events is we actually hear from Walt Whitman about Oscar Wilde's talk. So Walt Whitman wasn't able to attend Oscar Wilde's talk. If you don't know, Walt Whitman, he comes to Camden, New Jersey after being in Washington, D.C., when he was a nurse during the Civil War. In 1873, he suffers a stroke, and he leaves Washington, D.C. to be with his brother, George Whitman, who now is living in Camden, New Jersey. And what's very interesting is he actually went down to D.C. because of George. George was fighting for the Union, and Whitman thought he was wounded. So that's why Whitman actually goes to D.C. in the first place, but then he becomes a Civil War nurse. Okay, so now he's not really able to move around that well, though, during this period. This is 1882. So he didn't usually attend a lot of events. Okay, but a journalist does go to Walt Whitman's brother's house. He's still living with George Whitman at this time. And we get a little section here called Walt Whitman on Aesthetic Poetry. And the journalist asked Walt Whitman, "So what do you think of this Oscar Wilde figure?" And this is Whitman's response. The announcement that arrangements are being made to have Walt Whitman, the poet, meet Oscar Wilde on his arrival in this city has caused considerable speculation among the aesthetes as to how the venerable naturalist, so Whitman is called the venerable naturalist by the journalist, regards the young poet. Mr. Whitman had just returned from a trip in New Jersey when he said to a Times reporter yesterday, "I must certainly be excused from giving any opinion, as I have not really read a line of Oscar Wilde. I read very little nowadays of anything, only the daily synopsis of news, and almost never read poetry. I am most cordially disposed to give the poetry of aestheticism a fair chance. Let us see what it can do. The aesthetes are young, and the field is wide." So, if you couldn't tell, I get a lot of humor out of what I research, but it's because both Oscar Wilde and Walt Whitman have such a way with their phrasing and a sort of salacious gossiping happening. So Whitman is ready to open the doors to Oscar Wilde and the young aesthetes, but he's just not going to read the work because he says he doesn't really read now anyways. Again, is he playing it up? I think there's a lot of playing up going on here. A lot of performing is happening here. Okay.
Sit right down.
And then this next section is actually on the left. I was able to find Walt Whitman's letter to Oscar Wilde. So Walt Whitman receives a letter from Oscar Wilde and the press team too, asking if Whitman would come to Philadelphia, to Center City, right? And if you don't know, Camden is right on the Delaware River, so it's right across from Center City. But Whitman would take the ferry, which he did a lot of times. However, this time he's not going to go to the hotel to see Oscar Wilde. So he actually asks, well, will Oscar Wilde come to visit him at his brother's house? Oh, and there's a picture of the Aldine Hotel, which sadly, again, doesn't exist. Was knocked down. That tends to be a theme with a lot of these architectural places. Okay.
Right here, baby.
And then right here is another Whitman note, but it's actually not from Whitman. If you notice, it says Mr. Stoddard, who works with Whitman. So it says, Walt Whitman will be in from 2 till 3:30 till 3:30 this afternoon. I will be most happy to see Mr. Wilde. Okay. This is where I call ego playing a factor here. First of all, Whitman was always usually in his brother's house. I mean, he lived there. He was not really leaving and coming and going unless he was either A, visiting his friends, the Staffords, in their farm in Laurel Springs, which is about 20 minutes east of Camden, where he would spend summers, and that's where he wrote a lot of Specimen Days. Begins by Big Timber Creek. That's in Laurel Springs. Or once in a while, and you will see, Whitman does start to do lectures in Philadelphia. He actually goes back to New York City to do a lecture on Abraham Lincoln. And he would tour some of South Jersey. So he actually went to a town called Haddonfield, which is also right next to Camden as well. But every day, from what I've read of Horace Troubles with Walt Whitman, which is this massive volume series of all different correspondence that Trouble writes down of just interviewing Whitman. Trouble is Whitman's biographer. Whitman was always home. So I don't know why it says from 2 till 3:30, except it makes it seem like Whitman is only available at the specific time, and Oscar Wilde must concede to Whitman. And Oscar Wilde does concede. So is there some ego going back and forth? Yes, but the younger writer decides he will go see Walt Whitman. And he will leave Center City and go to Camden. So Wilde heads to Camden, New Jersey on January 18th, 1882. On the left is the Philadelphia section of the ferry, and on the right is the Camden section of the ferry. And so you'll see here that it was very easy for Whitman and Wilde to go back and forth across the Delaware River. And I don't know if you can make it out, it's hard to read, but on the left side it says the railroad ferry to Cape May and Atlantic City. And what would have happened if you were going and landing in Camden, you had the option to then go to the Jersey Shore towns and take the railroad. Okay, so Wilde arrives at George Whitman's house, 431 Stevens Street, Camden. Sadly, that house is torn down, but Whitman, I'll shout out here to the Whitman Camden Association. I've gotten to tour that house, and it's, I can't recommend it highly enough. Well, I recommend touring the birthplace, but if you get a chance to tour Whitman's final home in Camden, it's also just really helps to understand his sense of place. So he does buy his own home, but it's in 1884, so 2 years after he meets Oscar Wilde. Okay, and then I found pictures of Whitman and Wilde around the time. So the Wilde one, you've already heard. This is when he does his photo shoot with Napoleon Serrani in Union Square, looking very dapper. And then Whitman, this is him around the age of 62, but it's actually in 1887, so he's a little older. And I can really see this venerable naturalist type of imagery that the journalist is describing here. So this is Whitman at the end of his life. He dies in 1892. Okay, so the edition you see on the right is called Poems of Walt Whitman, and it was edited by William Rossetti. William Rossetti was the brother of Dante Rossetti. If you know some of Victorian poetry, you know the Rossetti family plays a big role. Christina Rossetti wrote Goblin Market. And Dante Rossetti was an artist. William Rossetti's an artist. So William Rossetti decides he is going to publish Walt Whitman's poetry for the first time in England. However, Wilde knew about Whitman's poetry way before this edition arrived in England. He first started reading it when he was 11. His mother, Jane Francesca Agnes, she's known as Speranza. She was a poet, an Irish poet. She actually got an American edition of Leaves of Grass. How? Through some illegal means, but she received it. And she begins reading Leaves of Grass to her son, Oscar Wilde. Whitman does not enjoy when the 1868 edition comes out of William Rossetti's edition of Leaves of Grass because it is severely altered. A lot of poems are cut, some stanzas are cut, and I'll explain where some of that happens. However, William Rossetti makes it very clear when he writes to Walt Whitman that because of censoring issues in England, and especially because of sodomy laws they had, and very strict obscenity laws, he was not able to publish some of Whitman's more erotic poetry. However, that erotic poetry is not the male same-sex desire poems of Calamus. The ones he has to really cut is Children of Adam, where it's sexual desire between men and women. And the same happens here in America in the Boston edition of 1860, where Children of Adam is put through the ringer. Calamus, not so much, which speaks to the cultural attitudes and ideas of what male romance looked like at the time, and friendship and also desire. So right away in 1868, and I'll give you an example of something that was cut. So I'm just going to take a water break. So something that's cut is where Whitman, in one poem, he writes, I turn the bridegroom out of bed. So this is the speaker. I turn the bridegroom out of bed and stay with the bride myself. I tighten her all night to my thighs and lips. Rossetti cut it. And Rossetti wasn't even told to cut it by publishers. Rossetti just cut everything he thought was going to be objected to. So he goes a little too far with the editing process. Right away, though, in 1868, there is a poem called Singing in Spring. And let me share my screen so you can see it. Oh, and I should mention, Caitlin posted in the chat a link to the poems that I'll be reading from. So I'm not going to read all of the poems, but that way you have access to it. Okay. Well, actually, so the first poem in 1868 is starting from Pomonoc. So even the British readers get introduced to how captivating Long Island is for Whitman's poetics. Because Pomonoc, if you don't know, was the Native American term for Long Island. And Whitman uses it also to refer to the fish shape of Long Island. Okay, so calamus. You might be asking, what is that on the right? Is that a certain corn crop? No. I always thought it was it might be related. I don't know. I'll have to check about that. But calamus is a plant, and it is indigenous in the Northeast. So Whitman grew up around calamus. However, I'll note it does have a certain phallic shape. So that's where calamus really does have a lot of sexual desire shared between men. And I'll give you an example. So this is actually in the 1868 English edition that Oscar Wilde read as well. Oscar Wilde talks about reading the 1868 when he's in Oxford, and that's the edition that he's reading with the Victorian poets. So, and here what I now draw from the water, waiting in the pond side. Oh, here I last saw him that tenderly loves me, and returns again, never to separate from me. And this, oh, this shall henceforth be the token of comrades. This calamus root shall interchange it, use with each other. Let none render it back. And twigs of maple, and a bunch of wild orange and chestnut, and stems of currants and plum blows, and the aromatic cedar, these I compassed around by a thick cloud of spirits, wandering, point to, or touch as I pass, or throw them loosely from me. So this is from Singing in Spring. And I just want to demonstrate what the speaker is describing here is finding the plums, the currants, the calamus root, and just kind of, in a way, doing a sort of knitting job of just creating a certain, well, the speaker says twining. So just wrapping around all of these different materials. And this becomes the token of comrades and also of manly love that the speaker says all men who are experiencing these types of feelings need to carry around with them. So I'm going to jump to another poem that gives us a little more of what I've called homoerotic vision in Whitman. And homoeroticism, if you don't know what that means, it just means same-sex desire. Desire shared between the same sex. Okay. So this is some thoughts on Whitman's ideas of sex in his poetry. He's responding to Ralph Waldo Emerson's letter from 1855. because Ralph Waldo Emerson infamously reviews, well, he doesn't know that he's going to be quoted by Whitman, but Whitman uses Ralph Waldo Emerson's private letter as a marketing tool. So Wilde really is learning a lot about marketing from Whitman. Whitman says, quote, "I say that the body of a man or woman, the main matter, is so far quite unexpressed in poems, but the body is to be expressed in sexes." Emerson wanted Whitman to censor the Children of Adam, not the Children of Adam, sorry, that's 1860. He wanted Whitman to censor parts of Song of Myself, where there's open discussion of erotic desire. And Whitman says, no, I won't do that. Now I'm going to jump back to the 1868 British edition. This is called Love of Comrades in the edition, but it's actually poems that you can find in Calamus. And this is where the British edition, why Whitman objects to it, it cuts. So where it says one, it actually doesn't begin, "Come, I will make the continent indissoluble," in Whitman's American editions of Calamus. This comes, just want to make sure I get it exactly right, but it actually comes from a full-length Calamus poem, and William Rossetti just cut and altered the poem and decided he would just keep this certain section. So I'll read the sections that are kept, and it'll continue this theme of how comradeship is all represented by the calamus plant as a certain token. So, "Come, I will make the continent indissoluble. I will make the most splendid race the sun ever yet shone upon. I will make divine magnetic lands with the love of comrades, with the lifelong love of comrades. I will plant companionship, thick as trees, along all the rivers of America, and along the shores of the Great Lakes, and all over the prairies. I will make inseparable cities with their arms about each other's necks, by the love of comrades, by the manly love of comrades." Okay, so if you wanted to find this full-length edition in Whitman's American edition, it would be Calamus 5 is the number. And I didn't include this section in the PowerPoint, but I'll read it from the edition I have. So the third part of this says, "For you these from me, O democracy, to serve you, ma femme, for you, I am trilling these songs, in the love of comrades, in the high towering love of comrades." So Whitman's speaker emphasizes that democracy is going to flourish through physical touch and interaction between manly love. That's how democracy will survive. Calamus comes out in 1860. The Civil War is soon to follow. So if you've read a lot of Whitman's poetry, even in Song of Myself, there's a foreshadowing that's starting to happen of the divide that's going to come in the country. And I also want to point us to another poem that Wilde would have been very familiar with. And that's why I'm reading these, because these are the poems Wilde would have been most intimate with, because this is from the British edition. Here we go. Let's see. So this comes from, in the British edition, it's called Pulse of My Life. It's also Calamus 6. I'm just going to read the end. It says, "Not in the murmurs of my dreams while I sleep, nor the other murmurs of these incredible dreams of every day, nor in the limbs and senses of my body that take you and dismiss you continually. Not there. Not in any or all of them. O adhesiveness! O pulse of my life! Need I that you exist and show yourself any more than in these songs?" So adhesiveness. Right. Not only the dictionary definition of togetherness, but it comes from Whitman's fascination with a science called phrenology, which was basically a science that really believed in these different spots you can see on the head are labeled. So adhesiveness is lit up there in that one section on the side of the head. And what a phrenologist would do, and I guess I'll use my head as an example, a phrenologist would start to feel for different bumps or grooves or, kind of just wherever they thought a lot of propensity or you had more of an inclination in one certain area of your head. And that meant, okay, well, maybe I have more adhesiveness. I tell my undergrad students that phrenology is like what we think of right now with horoscopes and astrology, where, they're entertaining. And I'm not going to say, I'm not going to cast away horoscopes, but you get certain things out of them. But there's non-believers and there's believers. That was the same way phrenology was viewed in the 19th century. And I mean, horoscopes were around then as well. Okay, so let me flip. Okay, so the painting on the left, I always use this with my students to demonstrate Whitman's homoerotic poetics, and it's because it's done by Thomas Eakins, who is a very famous Philly painter of the 19th century and was good friends with Whitman as well. And interestingly, paints the swimming hole as a talkback to the 28 Bather section of Song of Myself. And if you've ever been to the, I think it's technically called, I call it PAFA. In the Philly area, we call it PAFA, but I think it's technically called the Pennsylvania Museum of Fine Arts or something like that. That's where you can actually find the Walt Whitman painting that Thomas Eakins did, the portrait painting. So Calabash 26 is also in the 1868 British edition. And I'll just read a little of it. It says, "We two boys together clinging, one the other never leaving, up and down the roads going, north and south excursions making." Notice the allusion to north and south, not only north and south bodily of this type of desire, but north and south of the Union and the Confederacy. This imagery is starting to come in here. Power enjoying, elbow stretching, fingers clutching, armed and fearless, eating, drinking, sleeping, loving. Gotta love the Whitman cataloging. No law less than ourselves owning, sailing, soldiering, thieving, threatening, misers, menials, priests alarming, air breathing, water drinking, on the turf or the sea beach dancing, with birds singing, with fishes swimming, with trees branching and leafing, cities wrenching, ease scorning, statuettes mocking, feebleness chasing, fulfilling our foray. Okay, so I always like reading that poem because it really shows us this metaphor that Whitman starts to build, where it connects back to why democracy is so important to Whitman, because manly love is what he thinks will bring the country back together. It will suture the country. But also here we get this really bodily metaphor of just fingers grabbing, embracing and hugging. And I think right now, during the current moment, an embrace, almost, it seems like a very radical idea right now. Okay. So on the right, and I know this is in The Birthplace, the picture of Peter Doyle and Walt Whitman. When I always read Calabash 12, I always think of the relationship between Peter Doyle and Walt Whitman. I call this Whitman's sexual fluidity. So meaning, I don't define Whitman using an LGBT identity. So, some scholars refer to Whitman as gay or queer. I don't use an identity on Whitman. I use queer. So I call this a queer meeting, this talk. Actually, I want you to see my face as I do this. So I call it a queer meeting, meaning queer as non-normative. so it could be sexually non-normative, it could be someone's relationship status, it could be how you live your life, you're going against the grain. The reason I don't label Whitman is because, as we'll see soon, I'm nearing the end, Whitman refuses to be labeled at the end of his life. And it will come soon. I'm foreshadowing what's to come in my talk, but a friend of Whitman's, John Eddington Simmons, keeps pressing Whitman to identify Calamus as homosexual poetry. Whitman keeps evading the question for years. For at least 10 years, he refuses to answer the question. And he just keeps saying, I really like your friendship, John Eddington Simmons. Thanks for being a fan. Not in that kind of phraseology. But eventually Whitman will say, these poems are not what you're saying they are. So because of that, I just respect Whitman's wishes in that way. And I also think because Whitman's poetry is so sexually fluid, meaning it just runs the spectrum, and there's so much homoeroticism. So I tend to look more into Whitman's poetry and the eroticism there than necessarily trying to identify Whitman. But, if you are someone who does identify Whitman in that way, and, it speaks to you, then I think I'm not going to take away that happiness that it gives, because it gives representation to the LGBTQ community, and that's important as well. So I'll always say that Whitman, is a queer figure, is how I'll phrase it. Okay. So when I read Calamus 12, I'm just going to read a few lines. The beginning says, the speaker asks, are you the new person drawn toward me and asking something significant from me? To begin with, take warning. I am probably far different from what you suppose. Do you suppose you will find in me your ideal? Do you think it's so easy to have me become your lover? Do you think the friendship of me would be unalloyed satisfaction? Do you suppose I am trusty and faithful? Do you see no further than this facade, the smooth and tolerant manner of me? Do you suppose yourself advancing on real ground toward a real heroic man? I always read this in terms of, I do think there's a biographical connection here with Peter Doyle and Whitman's friendship, relationship. I'm not going to read all of this section, but there's a lot of panic and anxiety from the speaker in this poem. The speaker says, oh, let some past deceived one hiss in your ears. How many have pressed on the same as you are pressing now? How many have fondly supposed what you are supposing now, only to be disappointed? There's a real fearfulness, and just, I think it's a fear of being outed. The speaker's afraid of being shown for who they are. And Peter Doyle, I'll mention real quickly, Peter Doyle, Whitman meets in Washington, D.C. Peter Doyle is a stagecoach driver. Whitman meets him on the stagecoach. And I'm going to read this section because it comes from Horace Traubel's biography. But this is how Whitman responds to Traubel when Traubel asks, so how did you first meet Peter Doyle? Well, this is what happened. You ask where I first met him. It is a curious story. We fell to each other at once. Oh, wait, so no, actually, this is Peter Doyle's words, because it says, I was a conductor. The night was very stormy. He had been over to see Burroughs before he came down to take the car. The storm was awful. Walt had his blanket. It was thrown round his shoulders. He seemed like an old sea captain. He was the only passenger. It was a lonely night, so I thought I would go in and talk with him. Something in me made me do it, and something in him drew me that way. He used to say there was something in me had the same effect on him. Anyway, I went into the car. We were familiar at once. I put my hand on his knee. We understood. He did not get out at the end of the trip. In fact, went all the way back with me. I think the year of this was 1866. From that time on, we were the biggest sort of friends. So, what's interesting is Peter Doyle actually fought for the Confederacy, and he's from an Irish family. And Whitman also developed a romance with a man named Fred Vaughan in New York City in the 1850s, who was also Irish. And then Oscar Wilde's Irish. It's just very interesting. Whitman always draws this Irish in my admiration. So Peter Doyle actually continues to correspond and visit Whitman while he's in Camden, New Jersey. So the relationship lasts a long time. Okay. So the immediate aftermath, when Oscar Wilde and Whitman visit together, Oscar Wilde is asked about it by a Cincinnati reporter. So somehow their meeting in Camden, New Jersey gets carried all the way to Cincinnati now. And the journalist asks Wilde about it. So this is how Wilde responds about what it was like meeting Walt Whitman. The room in America which has most impressed me was a little bare, whitewashed room in Camden Town, where I met Walt Whitman, whom I admire intensely. There was a big chair for him and a little stool for me, a pine table on which was a copy of Shakespeare, a translation of Dante, and a cruse of water. Sunlight filled the room, and over the roofs of the houses opposite were the masts of the ships that lay in the river. But then the poet needs no rose to blossom on his walls for him, because he carries nature always in his heart. This room contains all the simple conditions for art: sunlight, good air, pure water, a sight of ships, and the poet's works. Okay. And there's also some mention of Whitman asking Wilde if he would like some elderberry wine. And I think Wilde indulges. Wilde also and Whitman are asked by reporters separately, again, what they thought of each other. So Wilde responds, I think Mr. Whitman is in every way one of the greatest and strongest men who have ever lived. He is the simplest and strongest man I ever met. Whitman, and on the right, he actually talks about the elderberry wine, and he describes it this way. It was pure stuff, he said, but I would have drank it had it been vinegar. So when Wilde is in Whitman's presence, he'll do anything to impress Whitman. Okay. And then this is how Whitman responds about Wilde. This is the farmhouse that he had visited in South Jersey. It's the Stafford farmhouse. And he befriended this son, Harry Stafford. So he's writing a letter to Harry Stafford, who lives at the farmhouse. He says about Wilde, he is a fine, large, handsome youngster, had the good sense to take a great fancy to me. So Whitman is very, very excited that Wilde is just so impressed with him. So because Wilde is a devoted fan, of course Whitman is happy and is going to let him into his home. But as you saw, Whitman was not going to extend an olive branch where he was going to visit Wilde. It was on his terms. And then I want to point also to, this is in one of the links that Caitlin shared. I'm not going to read the whole poem. It's a long poem. I make a lot of mention in it in my writing, though, because it's a poem written by Helen Gray Cone, who was actually the first female professor at what's now called Hunter College. She writes this poem in 1882. It's called Narcissus in Camden, and it is a poem where she reimagines what transpired between Whitman and Wilde, and she calls Whitman Pomanachides, the ruler of Long Island. She calls Wilde Narcissus. So the beautiful Greek youth in mythology who falls in love with his own image, and by falling in love with his own image, wastes away and dies because he's only captivated by his image and he won't move away from the pool of water. Okay, so there's Helen Gray Cohn. And I'm just going to read a little of it. Yes. Okay. So this is just the beginning of the poem. It says, it begins with Pomonockides. Pomonockides, he says, and this is done as a very dramatic, we'd call it a dramatic poem, meaning there's dramatic dialogue back and forth. Pomonockides says, "Who may this be? This young man clad unusually, with loose locks, languorous, glidingly toward me, advancing, toward the ceiling of my chamber, his orbic and expressive eyeballs uprolling, as I have seen the green-necked wildfowl, the mallard in the thundering of the storm, by the weedy shore of Pomonoc, my fish-shaped island. Sit down, young man. I do not know you, but I love you with burning intensity. I am he that loves the young men, whosoever and wheresoever they are or may be hereafter, or may have been any time in the past. Loves the eyeglass literati, loves also and probably more the vendor of clams, raucous-throated, monotonous chanting, loves the elevated railroad employee of Mannahatta, my city. I suppress the rest of the list of the persons I love, solely because I love you. Sit down, Eleve, I receive you." So I really urge you to read the rest of the poem because it's fascinating. But who knew in 1882 this type of erotic expression shared between men is being written about and published? So Helen Gray Cohn, she takes no expense to explain that Pomonockides, who, if you do a little digging, you know is Walt Whitman, loves the looks of young men. It's there for all to see. So it's not like this is being censored by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, and then I'm nearing the end, and I can't wait. I hope there's a lot of Q&A. I'm excited to see how you all are receiving this. Okay. So Wilde's famous line, "The kiss of Walt Whitman is still on my lips," comes from when he's talking to his friend George Ives. He writes to George Ives in 1892. This is a date we all remember in Whitman land as Whitman's death year. He writes it when asked about what he thinks about the passing of Walt Whitman. How does he respond? Well, the kiss of Whitman is on my lips still. That's how he memorializes Whitman. I think there's a lot to that, and maybe we'll talk about that more in the Q&A, but I find this really fascinating that his memorial is about this physical touch. That I haven't found whether or not that actually happened, but it's some nice salacious gossip we can indulge in. I think like if we were doing a certain, I've always thought about how this would be presented as a film, and I think there's a lot that filmmakers could do with that line. So I'm going to end with John Eddington Simmons, who I've already mentioned, who is really good friends with Oscar Wilde. Simmons, along with Edward Carpenter, they write a book called Sexual Inversion. And I'm teaching some of this to my students, parts of sexual inversion, because they take Whitman's Calamus cluster and they use it as a case study for a condition they call the homosexual man. So they use it as a medical definition, his poetry. I'm not going to read all of this. It's very also, I always warn my students, it's very dense. And it's an experimental form. This is the invention of sexology, the study of sexuality. But they said that sexual inversion is when a sexual instinct is turned by inborn constitutional abnormality toward persons of the same sex. It is thus a narrower term than homosexuality, which includes all sexual attractions between persons of the same sex. So in Carpenter and Simmons' Sexual Inversion, they say that homosexuality is actually a more heightened and a more respected, because they call themselves homosexuals. And they say, well, Whitman's poetry, Calamus, shows the first use of the homosexual in poetry. So, of course, it's an elevated idea of sexuality, and it's a respectable idea of sexuality when men desire other men. However, the sexual inversion, I'm not going to get into it a lot here, but if you want to ask me a question about it, I'll be happy to answer a question. Is actually a degraded orientation in their minds. And it also starts to become very class privileged as well. Homosexuality gets tied to aristocratic men, and Wilde is very aristocratic. So is Edward Carpenter and John Eddington Simmons. However, if you know about Whitman, we would never call him an aristocratic man. Middle class, yes. But, you know, he came from a farming background on Long Island, and did not even go into high school. So, you know, he did not go through the Oxford channel that these Victorian writers did. Okay. This is actually one of the satirical cartoons I was talking about. This one here, though, is done by Thomas Nast, you know, infamous from Condé Nast, the now publishing company, one of the original Nasts. Imagines Oscar Wilde as Narcissus. So this Narcissus imagery really gets attached to Oscar Wilde. In America, they love portraying him as Narcissus. There's his sunflower. They had to put that there. And then, a year before Oscar Wilde goes to trial, and then eventually he does get imprisoned for sodomy, for having sex with a man who was a Lord Henry. Oh no, not Lord Henry, sorry. I'm thinking of a character in the picture of Dorian Gray. No, with his lover, Bosie. And if you want to ask me more about that in the Q&A, I'll happily talk to the trial. But I just want to read one section of a poem called The Disciple. So Wilde writes this poem, like I said, a year before he goes to trial. So it begins with, quote, "When Narcissus died, the pool of his pleasure changed from a cup of sweet waters into a cup of salt tears. And the Oreads came weeping through the woodland, that they might sing to the pool and give it comfort." And then I'll jump to the end. The pool is personified here, given human characteristics. So the Oreads, so the nymphs, these water nymph creatures, you know, ask, well, was Narcissus beautiful? And the pool answered, but I loved Narcissus because as he lay on my banks and looked down at me, in the mirror of his eyes, I saw ever my own beauty mirrored. And this kind of mirroring is something I take up to describe what's happening between Wilde and Whitman. It's a type of mentorship, but also what I call a queer mirror, where Wilde sees himself reflected back in Whitman. And I would argue Whitman sees himself as well. And I always, let me just say, I want to make sure, I think this is the last. Okay. Wait, I'll show you. Here are some more of the cartoons of the sunflower imagery. But sadly, the last cartoon is Wilde going, getting out of prison. Oh, and if you've never seen the Whitman Camden house, this is what it looks like in 1930s on the left, and on the right, there it is right in the middle. That's the present day Camden house. Okay. Then I have a picture of myself at Whitman's mausoleum, at his tomb in Harley Cemetery. Again, another really fulfilling Whitmanic pilgrimage to take. And I do, as I look at this, I also wonder, Whitman died in 1892. I think about how would he have responded to Oscar Wilde being imprisoned for daring to love men. Okay. And I also do want to remark upon, well, first, this is a Whitman mural that exists in Camden, New Jersey. And a Whitman scholar who I have a long friendship with, wrote about this sexual desire, and I really enjoyed how Karen Carpenter wrote about this. She said that Whitman attempts to establish a definition of same-sex love before homosexuality exists, like I've talked about, but his vision, this homoerotic vision, is one of a supportive community of lovers, right? It's a shared desire between men. That's what Whitman means by manly love. Okay, so I'm nearing the end. First of all, there's been a lot of good work done on Oscar Wilde's tours in America, so I'm indebted to these writers. Thanks to Dr. Karen Carpenter, Dr. Susan Shekel for academic mentorship, friendship. It really is so meaningful to have them in my life. Thank you to Cynthia Shore and Caitlin Shea for your support at the Whitman Birthplace, for allowing me to have a platform here to discuss my research. So that's the conclusion of the talk. I'm really excited for the Q&A, and I hope everyone gains something out of that. And I'll mention too, I have a little display back here, and here's a paper doll of Whitman that I like to keep at my office desk, along with different editions of Leaves of Grass, Oscar Wilde's writing, but also there's a book here called The Kiss of Walt Whitman, Still on My Lips, and it's a book of poetry written by Raymond Luxac, and he actually continues to reimagine what happened between Whitman and Wilde. So I think Helen Gray Cohn would be proud. Okay, so thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew. Wait, I'm gonna come back. That was so awesome to learn so much more in depth about these two monumental poets, and just you've given them like a new dimension through your talk tonight. And again, just your ideas are so inventive for, further researching these two poets and how their writing reflects, the way that they approach their poetry. So I want everyone to unmute for a minute, and we're going to give a big round of applause to Andrew. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Awesome, Andrew. Thank you. And I also want to remind everyone that you can type in the chat, or you can come right on video and have your questions, your comments. One thing I left out, and I just want to mention it, is, again, all of our events are on our YouTube, and we do have a goal right now where we really want to increase our subscribers, and that's because we'll get a very fancy URL for our YouTube if we get to 100 subscribers. So we'd really appreciate that. So you could, again, watch this and share this video once it's up next week. And you can check out Andrew Rimby's wonderful Janes Hill hike that we had. That's gotten a lot of views, Andrew, for good reason. So definitely check that out too. And all right, so if you want to come on video or you want to write in the chat, and again, those links are in the chat, the ones that Andrew was mentioning too, to get some further in-depth information on those poems that were too long to read. So I'm just gonna come. All right. Wonderful. And we have some wonderful comments in there already, Andrew, and I'll make sure you get a copy of this.
Yeah, I think I saw, thank you, Mark. He said that at home in that letter that it's a convention in Victorian, a Victorian phrase to let people know that they can now pay a call. So yeah, I'm still just so, well, you can tell I'm passionate, but I'm so struck on Whitman's terms. It's like he's at home all day. So it's not, he's not doing a flexible schedule with Oscar Wilde.
Right. Yeah, no, it's amazing. I don't think many people even know that they met. Like, I remember when I found it on the internet, it's just really fascinating.
Oh, and sorry, I forgot to mention. So the first meeting's in January 1882. The second meeting, there's actually a second meeting. There's not a lot written about that one. But I found that they met when Wilde was going to leave America. He met Whitman again in May 1882. So it was two meetings. And they continued to write a few letters too.
Rusty, did you want to share?
Yes, that was wonderful, Andrew. I appreciate your enthusiasm, and it warms my heart, and
Oh.
it's very special to me, you know. There's also another angle too. You have, a young man like you, gung-ho, and then you have an older person like Whitman, let's say, and me winding down. He had a stroke, and you could see that Oscar is just excited to meet his idol. And I think that kiss on the lips is also, oh my God, like he'll take it forever because it means so much to him. And in who I am too, I have many kids want to kiss and hug me, and they're all beside themselves. And the same thing when I met the famous poet Marie Ponceau. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rusty. And
You're
I love your
welcome.
work too, because if you don't know, I attended when you did a poetry reading. So
You did?
yeah, I did. Wow, that was a Stonewall edition that you did.
Oh, yes, I'm a
Yeah,
Stonewall
yeah,
pioneer.
yes, you are.
Yes.
And you're
And
right. There's a certain mirroring happening even with my devotion to Walt Whitman and to Oscar Wilde. Like um, intergenerational conversations, and they're so important between the LGBTQ community right now.
and it's wonderful because it was the millennial children, if you will, like Walt Whitman called Oscar, that actually has resurrected me as well. And so it's exciting, and I'm ready, to wind down, and all these wonderful kids are, coming around. So I guess I would feel the same way sitting with, someone. But Oscar happens to be also, I absolutely adore Oscar. And Oscar, is a pioneer for me. And I always say that. And also Walt, I respect them greatly. And so they are our true early pioneers in our community.
Exactly. Well, and Oscar Wilde puts himself on the line in the trials, right? Like he
Oh
doesn't
my
have
God.
to. Like
Yes.
I urge everyone to read the trial transcripts because
Hmm.
he doesn't have to out himself in that way, but
Right.
he makes it his mission to basically um, stand up for um, his orientation and just what his identity is. And he knows that there's going to be backlash, but he does have a way where they keep saying his publishing team keeps
Hmm.
urging him to just stop and settle
Right.
and not go to jail. But yeah, I think that's the main difference for me between Whitman and Wilde
Hmm.
is Whitman doesn't put himself on the line. And I'm not saying what's right or wrong, but he doesn't take that kind of political stand. Like Wilde puts himself into politics.
Right. Like you think of the time period, even when I fought at Stonewall at the riots, uh, you go back to Walt. He's an older man. He's like the Mattachine Society,
Yeah.
who don't want to ruffle feathers. And
Mhm.
he may be afraid, because he has his career on the line. He's a famed poet. There's many variables in that. And meanwhile, Oscar's flamboyant and it really is in disbelief of it. I think that's what also fuels him. But yeah, there's a lot of variables.
Well,
Exciting, though.
exactly. Well, thank you so much, Rusty, for
You're
that. And
welcome.
I see on the chat, Leonardo said, if Wilde and Whitman were lovers. Oh, no, no. Well, I'm not arguing that they're lovers. I mean, some have tried to gossip about that, but I think like what Rusty's bringing up right now, that was his mentor. That's his, you know, who he's found himself in Walt Whitman. And you're right. I love how you phrased that, Rusty, about the kiss. Just that's the memory he'll always think about with Walt Whitman, um, and approval. And I think Margaret, she even adds more credence to that. That Oscar implied that Walt's kiss was an anointing. Yeah, very like a religious experience in a way. Yeah, no, thanks for that, Margaret. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, we have so many wonderful people joining us tonight. I just want to say, Rusty, we've had you join us for that Stonewall talk and in our open mics, which we love having you. And Leonardo, I know you from Instagram. He's one of our great Instagram followers, so it's great to have you here too. And Margaret is our historian at the birthplace. So.
Oh, and I think Iris too jumped in earlier.
Yes, Iris.
Oh, she said that you have a copy of Eakin's portrait.
Yes, we do.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's
and
right
it's
in
called
the
the
lobby when
Pennsylvania.
you walk in.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we made a few copies.
I mean, it's not the original, but it's a really nice copy, obviously.
Yeah, so the original, it's the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
It's called
Yeah.
Papa.
I wanted to say something else to you, Andrew.
Yeah.
I think that there was a very strong dynamic between them. And I think that Walt really had a feeling of almost jealousy about Oscar, because Oscar was a young man. He was like in his 20s, right, as you mentioned. And Walt, although he loved men, he was almost closeted. You know, he expressed it in his writings. He expressed it in certain ways privately with friends and so on. But Oscar was flamboyant. I mean, he just let it out there. And I think Walt was a little jealous of him, or envied him more, envied a man who was so young, who could just put it out there, where Walt had to keep it inside in many ways. And especially towards the end of his life, he almost disowned it, because he had this image of himself that he wanted for all posterity, for people to remember. And I think he felt that for them to remember him more as the good, great poet, rather than a man who loved men, was, you know, because of the times and how it was so shunned on during those times. And I think there's a little bit of envy that he envied Oscar. And I think Oscar, which was great that you brought out that Oscar's mother read Walt to him when he was a little boy. That was amazing that you mentioned that. And he was like an idol to Oscar, obviously. So Oscar's thing was, I'm going to see my idol. And Walt was, I'm a little resentful of this guy, but hey, let's get together and see what happens. So whatever happened, I think it was awesome that they got together.
Yeah, no, I love that. Thank you for that, Iris, because or like some listening right now might not know that Whitman's infamous line to John Eddington Simmons on his deathbed, I think it's 1891 when he writes that final letter, says that no Calamus does not have any homosexual tones in it. You've misread my work. I sired 6 children.
Right. Hello.
Throws out this, throws out this line that there's no credibility in that.
Exactly.
But I really like you said, he's containing his image, preserving his image.
Yeah.
And I think Whitman really was an image person. And
he absolutely was. There's over 133 photographs of him.
Yeah.
He definitely wanted to put himself out there. He wanted people to know who he was. He had an image of himself. You know, every man, I mean, he just wanted a certain image to be preserved for all time. And he was very concerned about his image. So, but, all you have to do really, I mean, his poetry aside, but read his notebooks, the notes that he kept. And I mean, this is a man that loved men, and he was very secretive about it in a certain way, but it's very obvious of all his, his romantic intentions were always men. They were never women.
Yeah, it's true. Well, do you know that manuscript in one of his notebooks before the 1860 edition, there's actually a section and it's called, I don't know if I'm allowed to say it. I think I could say it's not a curse. And I mean, I'm already going there with this conversation. And it's in the notebook, so I'm not pulling it out of thin air.
Yeah.
He actually writes something called Dick Hunt. And that's his line in the notebook. And I mean, right, it comes from the phrase Tom, Dick, or Harry, right? Any man, which also has a lot of loaded references in that phrase. But he starts to just jot down all these men in Manhattan who he just watches. Like he'll write Thomas, George, and like every everything about their physical body.
And that was the time when he was visiting Pfaff's saloon, and
Yes,
he
yes.
would sit in the back with his pretty boys, and he could be actually, himself there in that particular atmosphere. So, yeah, and he would wander the streets of Manhattan, notating certain men that he met and whether he slept with them that night or not, so.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting because he actually warns Oscar Wilde. I didn't read this part of the interview, but he actually warns Oscar Wilde, or Oscar Wilde is getting talked about by the journalists as, like what Iris just said, as flamboyant. Wilde called himself a dandy and enjoyed that flamboyant performance. Like, I argue it's a type of persona Oscar Wilde puts on. He's so performative, but Whitman actually says, oh, he's such a strong man, meaning Oscar Wilde. So, like what Iris is saying, and we're discussing, Whitman actually wants to start to do press damage, or PR. He actually starts doing PR for Oscar Wilde to, like, contain his image, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
Protect him. I think he sees it as protecting Oscar Wilde.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He probably had a almost fatherly feeling towards him in a way.
Yeah.
As he was, especially like with his siblings and so on, he really had that feeling of caring for the younger people, younger men, and so on. So yeah, he felt probably that way towards him.
Yeah, and I think too, like,
he probably really liked him.
Yeah, no, he really.
Yeah.
It shows that he really liked Oscar Wilde. I think, and I want to explore this a little more, even in my own research. But there's such a shifting of his, like, from that Pfaff cellar, of him notating all these men he's enjoying viewing their bodies, to being a nurse in the Civil War. And I really think the Civil War how can it not psychologically alter someone's mindset? Like, I think he starts to go into this protectionist mode. Like, I need to survive and I need to take care of myself.
He had unbelievable compassion.
Yeah.
He did. That was part of his character. He was just so compassionate and so loving and so kind that he was able to transform himself when he went into the Civil War situation, when he went to Washington, D.C., and totally lose himself. And this is a guy who really thought a lot of himself, but he was able to lose himself, in the care that he gave to those poor boys that were laying on cots and blankets and arms and legs off, and he did that for like 9 years.
Yeah.
And then he has a stroke at the end of it.
Yeah, and didn't care that he befriended Peter Doyle, who was a Confederate soldier. He
was actually an omnibus driver. You said he was a stagecoach driver. He was an omnibus driver, where where, like, we have buses today that run, but it would be horses carrying a bus, sort of.
No, thank you for that. Yeah.
So
No. Thanks for that correction.
Yeah.
Maybe I was confusing. I think Fred Vaughn was a stagecoach driver.
Maybe. I don't know.
But no, that's good. I'm going to make sure I take note of that.
But Peter definitely was an omnibus. He drove, and like you said, it was a beautiful meeting. That was his words. They met on the bus and they connected immediately. Yeah. And I think Peter was the love of his life. I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Iris. It's so good seeing you too.
Same here. Come visit us soon.
I will.
I'll get back. We're open for tours, everybody. Okay, we're open from Wednesday to Friday, 1 to 4, and on Saturdays from 11 to 4. So everybody come on down.
And you can meet Iris. You're there a lot of hours, Iris.
I'm like there all the time. So
Iris is an excellent tour guide.
She really is.
You know everything about the family.
That's why she trains everyone.
There you go.
To share. So, thank you, Iris. It's so good seeing you.
It's a fascinating subject. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can always see Iris.
Hey, Lynn, did you cut your curls off?
Well, oh, I did.
Oh my God, you did?
I did.
Oh, wait,
what a difference. She cut off all her curls.
I know. It looks good, Caitlin. Oh, wait, I think I'm getting a chat question.
Yes. Well, we have a few. Wait, I just want to make sure you see this one, Andrew, from John Roche. Wonderful
okay.
talk. Are you including anything on Walt's meeting with another Dublin author, Bram Stoker?
Well, thanks for that question, John. Do you want to come on the screen, John? You don't have to ask the question, but I'm always just curious, like I like seeing people's faces.
I'm on the screen here already.
Oh, I see you, John. Hey, John. Yeah, it's an interesting
you know,
question.
yeah.
I know a lot, like I've read a lot about that meeting with Bram Stoker. Well, I showed Caitlin before everyone came on. I have now Hocus Pocus merchandise in my apartment. I'm a huge Gothic fan, and Halloween and horror are probably my favorite. Just everything, genres, categories. So I love Dracula. I teach it a lot. It's an interesting meeting between them. However, there's not a lot of journalism on it. So the only reason I don't talk about it a lot is because there's not as much fanfare. I'm really interested in why Wilde's lecture tour. I also argue though it's a type of press tour happening. Why does that get taken up so much and sensationalized? But Bram Stoker, no one's really writing anything about that. It's a private meeting. But I might mention it just in relation to other authors who had visited Whitman. But yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up because it is true. Whitman is being visited in the 1880s by many UK authors. Because I think he's also Edward Carpenter also visits him too. Yeah.
More than one. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So he has his devoted he has the devoted Irish British fans.
And the larger question is why in a way was he picked up by the British and Irish almost the way Poe was by the French? I mean, yeah.
That's a good question, John. I mean, my speculation is it really has to do with that edition that was published in the British edition. And because it's so truncated and it's actually easier to read, it's much smaller than any other American edition. And I think because it has such a focus on his erotic poetry, like even though it's censored, it still is, the heart of it is really Calamus. So because of that, I think that's why it's shared between this devoted Oxford male Victorian group. And they start to form a pilgrimage to keep going to see Whitman. So I think I just keep thinking if I was in this small group of fans and I say, okay, I just went to London to see such and such writer. Okay, now you have to see them. Okay, now you have to see the person. And it's like the whole group has to eventually see Walt Whitman. And I think, the American reception, there is a type of, circulation of this homoerotic idea, especially with Horace Traubel, his biographer, Peter Doyle, of course. But it doesn't really happen among the literary community in America, right? Like we don't have, I don't know, for example, I mean, Henry James is a big figure at this point, but there's not necessarily all these pilgrimages to see Whitman with the American authors. And I find that, it's interesting, but I think it's also because this Victorian group, it's their secret in a way. He's their secret poet. Yeah. No, thanks for that though, John.
Thank you.
I think I saw, I know Martha wrote something. Oh, about, well, thank you, Martha. That was a compliment. And then Leonardo sent me a private question. Leonardo, do you want me to read that aloud?
Oh, I think Leonardo is not with us at the moment. He
Okay.
was until just a second ago, actually.
I can mention it quickly. He just asked me like how, oh wait, he's back now. Thanks, Leonardo. Different levels of homosexuality that happens in their writing. So, you know, this is where I would say kind of what I was talking about with Rusty is this type of question where I don't call Whitman's writing homosexual just because he doesn't identify this way, but he has this queer sexual queer desire, and especially homoerotic desire that he has all throughout. Calamus, Song of Myself, Specimen Days. I mean, I think every writing has that part of Whitman in him. But Wilde is a different case. I don't know how many of you have read The Picture of Dorian Gray, but Wilde is really invested in desire between men, but because of this gothic nature of The Picture of Dorian Gray, it starts to get twisted into an obsession with youth, an obsession with beauty. Right? He's interested in beauty for beauty's sake, so I don't think it's a surprise. But really, I read Picture of Dorian Gray as these older men who want to control Dorian, this beautiful young man, and they want to control his voice. They want to control how he presents himself. Dorian decides he's going to stay young forever because he keeps getting applauded for being beautiful. So he decides to run with it and just let his portrait waste away in the attic, and he can continue looking beautiful forever. It's interesting because we see a lot of those narratives with women and not always with men. So that's why I always think Picture of Dorian Gray is so interesting, because Wilde basically turns that the Pygmalion tale on its head, because Pygmalion actually comes from a Greek myth that I'm forgetting right now the actual origin of Pygmalion. But yeah. So I think it's a different idea of homoeroticism that Wilde, and because of the trials, like I discussed with Rusty, Wilde takes on a political statement and actually says, like, I'm going to call this the love that dare not speak its name while I express this love. And he puts himself on the line. So, you know, he gets known now as kind of opening the closet. Wilde opens the closet for writers. And I think that's also where Iris was saying there's a tension between Whitman, or how Whitman views Wilde. And I think it's because Whitman sees Wilde is starting to do a certain radical performance. And it's not how Whitman would present himself at the end of his life. Margaret just said, in the 19th century, yeah, people develop relationships through correspondence. Oh, and Stoker claims he wanted to present Walt's Lincoln lecture in England. I didn't know that, Margaret. Wow, that's very interesting. Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's why with my project, I knew I had to talk about this transatlantic Whitman in England and Whitman in America, because Wilde, for me, he's the one who bridges the gap. He's able to somehow go, well, just because of his geography, back and forth with how their Whitman is approached. But as you saw, even with the American journalists, they're not interested in Wilde's ideas. They don't care about his lecture. I can't find anything about his lecture. All I find is that Wilde dressed in this beautiful fur coat. All they care about is his fashion. And, you know, I think Wilde loves that because he becomes a celebrity in America. So Wilde becomes a celebrity in America, Whitman becomes a celebrity in England. It's like they've swapped.
Yeah.
Oh, and there's another comment there from Margaret, Andrew, saying that Lincoln's lecture in England was not successful.
Oh, well. I know Whitman's lectures were pretty successful at the end of his life, from what I've read. on Lincoln. And I think he did also present in Union Square too at the end of his life on Lincoln. At, if I'm right, at the Cooper Union building. I'm pretty sure. Correct me if I'm wrong, Margaret. I know Margaret would know if I'm wrong in that regard.
And while we're speaking about celebrity, you know, Whitman was in Washington, D.C., so he could actually see Lincoln.
Yeah.
When he's coming in and out, which is pretty amazing. I'm sure he loved that. I
Yeah.
think there are some notes he took on that.
Yeah. No, and right, both of them. I mean, Whitman is so interested in chronicling his life. Like, I think that's why Whitman, I always turn to him, because he writes about everything in his life. And I mean, what other author has a biographer with multiple volumes of just Whitman quoting things every day? It's like, he's preserved his legacy. Let's see. Margaret said, oh, Wilde was 6 feet. Yeah, that's true. Wilde was a very tall figure in velvet knee breeches. He definitely made a sensation. That's for sure.
Mhm.
But again, it kind of reminds me of how we view reality television now. And I think this is why, you know, people can make fun of reality television, but it's so popular. I mean, my my show of unwinding are the reality housewives. And I think why I like it so much is because they're putting on so many performances, and I always find it so fascinating when a person pivots, like is able to change their persona, and they know how to play for the camera. And that's exactly what Whitman and Wilde, and I think that's why Wilde really wants to meet Whitman, is Whitman knows how to position himself in different spaces. And you know, I do think Whitman is one of the first really celebrity, self-made types of literary celebrities. Like, he's able to control his narrative, you know, which you really, like Edgar Allan Poe couldn't control his narrative. Like, he was seen in this very depressed light, even though a lot of Poe scholars say Poe was not actually probably that despondent in his life. Yeah.
All right. Well, Andrew, that was magnificent. Your presentation was awesome, but then also the discussion that it started. And I think we're all going to be thinking about this for a long time. It's just such an amazing topic. And then, yeah, it answered a lot of questions, but there's still so many other questions that we can start pondering about.
And I really want to get this film off the ground. If I could, like, just find, right? I'll have a collaborative screenplay team, but if someone knows film producers, I just think it would be such an interesting cinematic experience. They tried to do a play on Whitman and Wilde. It was, I don't know. I didn't get to see it, but, you know, well, I know I keep continuing this conversation, but I think what I've found can happen with this narrative is it starts to become so reality television focused that it becomes so gossipy that everything is just about, you know, what did they do bodily together? And that, to me, isn't what's fascinating. It's what are the journalists doing? What is the publishers doing? Like, there's all these teams behind them. Like, and it's not just the meeting, it's the aftermath. But yeah, okay. But that's my pet project, to get a film.
Might be the first.
Another phone call or something.
Oh, yeah.
Is it open?
Oh, do you have any questions? Okay. So you might be the person, though, Andrew, who successfully creates that screenplay. I would love to see that. And you have the two dramatic figures, so you can definitely visualize it very easily. But thank you so much again, and I hope that everyone joins us in October. Let's see, the first Sunday in October. So we'll have a walk through Huntington about Whitman and the history of Huntington Village, which again is like a major tourist attraction, but not many people know the history of that area. So Andrew, again, will be having this illuminating conversation where you learn so much. And I just want to unmute one more time for Andrew and give him another great round of applause.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Oh, and I saw, if you want to contact me, some people are asking me about my email, please email me. It's andrew.rimby@stonybrook.edu. So feel free to email me. And yeah, no, I can't wait for the Traveling Bachelor. Again, I'm a bachelor, so I think I decided to do something that mirrors. I'm really playing with this mirroring because it's enjoyable. But yeah, I'm going to show all the sites that would have existed in the 19th century when Whitman was writing about Huntington and
Right.
had his Long Islander newspaper there. So yeah, and I might also, have a little book review moment too, because I love the bookstore. But yeah, no, thank you, everyone. This was really just, I
Thank
love
you,
getting
Andrew.
to see all these people. And I hope you all have a good night and are
You too. We
staying
could
well.
go on all night about these
I
two
could.
guys.
This could be a marathon, but
I
I'm not
would-
going to do
I
that to
agree.
everyone here.
But just remember it in relation to, in my time, like Stonewall and all that, people have restraints on them too, different generations.
Yes, it's true.
Yep.
It's true, because
Yeah.
eventually I'll have conversations with a younger generation.
Yeah, see?
It happens quickly, I've
It
heard.
does.
Yeah, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Caitlin, too. You always do such a great job.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you all. We love having you every week. It's really keeping everyone in very high spirits, including me. So thank you so much.
Yes. This is the therapy we need.
Yes.
Okay, see you all.